gained access to more than 100 million Capital One customers' accounts and credit card applications.
Web application firewall or a proxy firewall, there's kind of two ways you can set it. And it's really important to know which one you're doing, because if you do it the wrong way, you create something called a server-side request forgery attack. All these data loss prevention tools just didn't exist.
It is a scary time.
Their CEO's laptop has already been compromised, and they can send phishing emails legitimately as that person whenever they want.
Yeah, it was very convincing phone calls claiming to be RCMP.
What we find is historically organizations will track something till it gets to 90% compliant. And they never actually do that last 1%. It goes on a risk register. People don't actually, follow it up because they just want to move forward with the next initiative.
Welcome back to Full Metal Packet. Today, we're joined by Ross Young, a guy who started his career in various three-letter agencies, one of the few places where you can legally operate on the offensive side of cybersecurity. Since then, he's brought the same pirate and ninja energy to stealthily improve security without all the paperwork as an enterprise CISO. He was at Capital One during the 2019 breach, wrote the book titled Cybersecurity's Dirty Secret, Why Most Budgets Go to Waste. And now he's the co-founder and CEO of Clear Capabilities, where he's building AI agents to automate the parts of security that usually just waste people's time. Ross, great to have you.
Hey, thanks again. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
You were inside Capital One when the breach happened. Can you take us back and what did the headlines actually miss?
Yeah, so I was in Capital One from 2018 to 2020, and the large-scale data breach happened in 2019. There was a former AWS employee who had a really robust knowledge of how to use AWS in order to steal data. And so what this insider was able to do, who was no longer employed at AWS at that point in time, was to figure out, hey, I could do server-side request forgery attacks and steal session keys from EC2 metadata service. And so we at Capital One had used a firewall from ModSec WAF, so a free open source firewall for many years. And even before I had gotten there, we had basically replaced most of it with a Barracuda, which was a newer web application firewall. So what we actually had missed was not everything was truly ported over. And so if you have things that are lying around in this massive shift, that's something always, pay attention to. The second thing that I would say is when you use a web application firewall or a proxy firewall, there's kind of two ways you can set it. You can set it for a forward proxy configuration or a reverse proxy configuration. And it's really important to know which one you're doing, because if you do it the wrong way, you create something called a server-side request forgery attack.
Why did this incident become such a case study for cloud security?
The first thing about it was in 2019, and yes, there had been a lot of AWS attacks, but most of them are what I would call dumb attacks. People left exposed data in public S3 buckets that should have never been public. Well, that's an easy misconfiguration that people make, and it's not really too tricky. But here we're talking about a former AWS employee who basically had insider knowledge of how EC2 metadata service worked. And so at this point in time, in 2019, Capital One was really big on AWS. We were using AWS for so many things in cybersecurity, including things like Guard Duty, which is a data loss prevention tool. Now, what this insider was able to really understand is when AWS builds out a brand new region, let's call this the Bahrain region, they don't actually put every AWS service out there on day one. They only have a small set of core services, and then eventually they add more and more services till it looks like a normal region. So this individual was very astute, and what they were able to do is essentially wait till a new region opened, and then they, perform this attack to steal data out of our company and other companies. All these data loss prevention tools just didn't exist, which meant they could pull data and we wouldn't have the ability to monitor that data exfil because that capability wasn't in region.
So I guess, so that's like a very specific situation that happened in that particular case. But if we kind of like zoom out a little bit, if a CISO heard, WAF misconfiguration, SSRF, permissions, and thought, hey, we fixed this years ago, like how would you challenge that kind of assumption or statement?
I think the first thing that I would say is every organization goes through modernization processes in their organization. There's some tool you're going to replace. Maybe you hated Splunk and their Splunk fees went up too high and you're like, we're going on a new tool, or it's an EDR or a firewall or any of these things. What we find is historically organizations will track something till it gets to 98, 90% compliant. And they never actually do that last 1%. It goes on a risk register. People don't actually, follow it up because they just want to move forward with the next initiative. And those little gaps are what's called the chinks in the armor. And if people are able to use AI tools to do attack surface discovery, sometimes they can find these things that should have just been configured properly, but we just never got around to doing it.
Could you maybe take us back to what were the first indications of a problem? Like, so, like how did this get discovered and what were the first kind of steps taken?
Yeah. So I'm not going to reveal that because I still think that's a little bit sensitive of how Capital One first determined that piece of what had happened. Capital One had a great team who had, previously worked with law enforcement, came from intelligence agencies. You can just think of, hey, we're in DC. There's a lot of former FBI, former CIA, former kind of, intel folks working at Capital One that were able to quickly turn this around in less than a day. I think the problem that we had was how did we actually detect this? Because it clearly wasn't through Capital One's internal means, because tools like the DLP had been turned off because it wasn't in region. So just knowing where those gaps are for your company, I think, is the big takeaway here.
Yeah, the attacker seems to, pick the bad, like one of the worst targets there with the history of the people working there. That's pretty interesting. Did the attacker only target Capital One, or were there other targets at the same time? Because it seems like a kind of broad AWS issue, not one that's specific to Capital One either.
Yeah, it was my understanding that this individual was scanning numerous companies to find these server-side request forgery attacks to do the EC2 metadata. So you can imagine they're using tools like Shodan to kind of figure out where this exists. It's a very niche case of, getting to EC2 metadata service. But, once you're there, you can get access to all these S3 buckets that are there. And, some of the things that ultimately were, revealed was Capital One had thought we had actually encrypted all of our data in our S3 buckets. But lo and behold, to us, it wasn't truly that way in implementation. And so we had a number of North American and Canadian let's say credit card information that was compromised, that then of course we had to do disclosures to attorney general offices and things like that in order to do the cleanup process.
And if this kind of stuff happens today to any kind of CISO or company, like what evidence would you recommend that you'd want to like collect and have as a CISO for a similar kind of exploitable event here in your environment? Like what would be the recommendation there?
I think the first thing to say is when anybody connects into our environment, do we absolutely know the source IP and have we proven multi-factor authentication? And so that is the key, because if you really know who they are and where they came from, that's a really, really good thing of what you can give to law enforcement to try to do a takedown operation. Now, obviously, people can masquerade their IPs, but you at least have one place of where it's originally entering your organization from. And then the other thing that I would say is, how do you actually, tie things back to user accounts? So much of things on the internet, they can be static S3 pages where nobody can actually harm those sites. But in order to get to anything that really requires user input, how do you actually put that behind a single sign-on tool for customers where now we know here's the username, here's the account, here's the information about that account that then is going to then, let's say, try to harm our website when they start, fuzzing with malicious inputs on forms and fields and URLs.
After, this particular event, what did this experience, teach you about, security teams and where they waste their time? Which I'm sure there's some lessons for your book that came out of that, if so?
I think the biggest thing here for me was, what are the things we think that are secure that just really aren't? And I'll just give you some examples here. I already mentioned that there's security initiatives you think that are completed, but maybe only got 99% complete. I think that's the first aha moment. The second thing that I would say is, what are the protections that you're deploying today that actually aren't protecting you? And I'll just give you an example. Imagine you have a web application and you put a firewall like a WAF in front of that web application. And your developers complain and say, it's actually, not working well with our site and causing some functionality issues. So what do most teams do? They go and they neuter the WAF and they turn off some of the rules. And so what happens is that CISO may not know that level of detail because that's, between an engineer on the WAF team and a developer in, some part of the organization. And so they think their, WAF is actually stopping all the OWASP top 10 attacks on all their sites. But lo and behold, we've actually made it a Swiss cheese firewall where there's holes and things we've turned off. And I think that happens more than you absolutely know at the CISO level. And so a lot of times we're thinking, oh, here's Log4j or some other things. And we're like, well, we have a WAF. It just stops those things. Well, only if the WAF is actually implemented correctly, right? And so are you actually able to go in and document everything like this on the risk register and know that? Or is that just like hidden only in firewall rules where only the dev team from 3 years ago, who doesn't exist anymore because they've all changed jobs, actually knows that insider knowledge, right? Those are the things I think that are really important to kind of, think about. What percent of my tools are actually 100% deployed and what percent of my tools are 100% configured correctly? Those would be, I think, key nuggets there on that root cause analysis.
The whole security space, I think, is very often like we have to trade, or people make the trade. Maybe you don't have to, but people tend to make the trade of security versus convenience, right? So like that exactly point you made, where it's like it was causing some issues. It's inconvenient to have those security things in there, so you start relaxing the rules, or you start making changes to get the convenience back, but then you end up reducing security sometimes critically.
Yeah, and what happens is we have misaligned incentives. If you go to almost any developer in any organization, you say, how do you get promoted? It's probably, I got to build, version 2 of this application. I got to, deliver all these new features this year. Very seldom will you actually see anything security related as a promotion or bonus requirement in their performance review. And so at the end of the day, if they have 200 vulnerabilities on their app, which, let's just say one vulnerability takes an hour to fix, and that's 200 hours of work, versus they're going to push out a new feature that, potentially gets them promoted or bonused, which one are they going to do? They're going to do the one that makes their incentives look good, right? And that, I think, is our biggest problem. Like, we need to make sure that developers in their performance situations are actually incentivized and have some skin in the game for vulnerability management and security.
But I mean, ultimately, no, you're right about that. But when you kind of like face the hard reality of operating in the corporate environment, you bring up a system, it's configured perfectly. Like, yep, this is exactly what I want. It checks all the boxes. You put it into production, expose it to the humans in the company, and now you start seeing all the edge cases. Oh, okay, well, this team needs this thing. Okay, I'll just open that up for them. That team needs something else. And if you push back and say, no, we're not going to do that, and here's a proper way to work around that, now you're being flooded with support tickets from the internal teams who are like, oh, I literally cannot do my job with this new secure system that you've built. Make it work right now. And how do you like ultimately balance these two conflicting kind of forces?
Ultimately, this goes down to what we would say is a risk register. There's going to be, here's an impossible requirement for the business to meet from a security perspective. I'll just give you the example of a healthcare company. Hey, we want everything managed and patched and secure. Makes perfect sense. Why wouldn't you? This MRI machine is running Windows XP, but creates, $10 million of revenue to this hospital. We're not going to patch it because the MRI software just doesn't have a newer version than XP. I can't patch. Well, they're probably not going to stop the MRI software. They're probably going to keep using it to make a lot of money for that healthcare. And we have to figure out how to isolate it. And so it's not going to meet our patch requirements. And we're going to document that on a risk register where the business is going to say, I'm going to accept the risk that we're not going to follow the patching requirement policy. The reason why is because this solution does XYZ, which is of huge benefit to the mission. And we're willing to accept this risk. Sometimes there's good trade-offs, like, oh, we can absolutely mitigate. Sometimes you can't. And I think those are the decisions you just have to document, because it's not cyber accepting the risk. It's the business accepting the risk despite the cyber recommendations.
It looked at first like an attack just on hospitals in the UK, but it's now becoming clear that this malicious software has run riot around the world.
Yeah. No hidden landmines, right? You need to know where you're going to step on these things. And some of this is, I think we look at it from a very negative perspective in cyber. And I'll just give you the example. Let's say in cybersecurity, we feel we are very insecure. We don't have an AI security program, and we really want one. So we go to the chief financial officer and we say, hey, we want one, but it's going to be $2 million a year. Every year, $2 million, because that's what it costs to build an AI security program. And the chief financial officer is like, yeah, that's really expensive. We don't have any extra money in the budget to do this. And he goes to you and he says, well, how bad is it going to be if it goes bad? And you say, well, we looked at, the average Verizon data breach report, and we estimated it's a $4 million risk. Okay, got it. And so he goes in and he says, you know what, I'm actually not going to fund you. And 4 years go by, and you've avoided spending, let's call it $2 million each for this AI security program. You haven't paid $8 million. And now you actually have that, $4 million breach that happens in your organization. You are out $4 million. But if you look at it from the lens of the chief financial officer, he actually saved the company $4 million by not having an AI security program for 4 years, which would have been $8 million, and you paid one $4 million breach. So he was not wrong in that scenario. And I think that's something that in cyber, it's hard to wrap our heads around, because we don't want to say we've enabled breaches. We want to stop all the breaches. But in some cases, it may actually be financially beneficial to go down that route.
That's a dangerous thing, though, no? Because you can say, okay, well, the breach cost this much, but like, how is that calculation made? Like, what about like lost potential revenue from these events? I mean, some companies, maybe they did that calculation and it's like, well, nobody cares if this happened. We just have to pay the compliance fees, the lawyer fees, and whatever else we need to pay. But for some businesses, it's kind of, extremely detrimental outside of the breach itself. But the trust in the brand or customer trust can be way more than that $4 million. In the case of the hospital, that could be very dangerous. It could even cost lives.
I think you have to look at it from the perspective of a company. What is the goal of a company? And it's generally to, maximize shareholder values and provide a great service that ensures long-term profitability. So you shouldn't do anything that's illegal, immoral, or unethical. But what I'm saying is, if you look at cybersecurity, we could spend all the money of the company and still not be secure. So there is some level of how much should I spend, right? And at that point in time, you have to make educated guesses of what we think this is going to be and how much should we spend. And remember, the risk tolerance of the CISO is different than the risk tolerance of the chief financial officer. And usually the people higher in the org chart actually get to make the ultimate call.
Well, actually, speaking of spending, kind of relates to the book that you wrote. What would you say is like the biggest budget black hole that exists in most corporate environments, where people, where leaders just burn money and think that, hey, this is actually doing something, but it's in reality, it doesn't do anything?
In my book, one of the chapters that I have is on murder boards. The idea being that you go to any large company, they probably already have 50, 80 different cybersecurity tools. And I don't think we ever actually really look at the effectiveness of each of those tools. So what I do is I use kind of two metrics. The first is what I call a coverage metrics. Think of, if I have a DLP agent on every one of my laptops, is it installed on 80% of the laptops in the org? 90% or 100% of the laptops. Makes a big difference if it's not installed or running. The second thing that I would go in is kind of this WAF feature that I mentioned earlier of what percentage of those important features are turned on, right? Because if you have that Swiss cheese firewall or Swiss cheese DLP, then it's not really doing anything. And so I like to take those two percentages and multiply them together. So just take the example of if I have a 90% deployment of my DLP or EDR tool or any other tool that's in your organization, and it has a 80%, utilization of all the important features, we take that 9 times 8 and we get a 72%, what I call an effective protection score. And we should do this on every one of the technologies we've deployed. And what you're going to figure out is where you are badly deployed, i.e. where you have bad coverage, or where you have bad implementations in your organization. And now you get to say, this tool that we're spending $3 million on with our headcount, with our licensing, with our tooling costs, we're only, giving an effective protection score of 40%. Are we going to fix this, or are we going to get rid of this tool? And then you really start to have those strategic discussions. And I think that's a really, really powerful thing, because you might actually go in and look at these tools. And another angle I always like to look at is over the last 12 months, what threat or what attack did it detect that you wouldn't have caught with any other tools? Because if it's not stopping something and, you're paying a lot of money and it's badly deployed, that sounds like, the right thing to get rid of in your organization. Now, remember, there are some things you have to do for compliance and legal reasons, but I think this is a really helpful way to kind of start thinking about using a murder board to figure out what things are not, let's say, producing their weight in gold or worth their value in our budget line that we can rip and replace and put something that's more effective.
Yeah, I think that's all really good information. I think we can make the distinction between two things. So you're talking about utilization of the tools that you're paying for, right? So underutilization is a huge waste of money. I think that's probably happens a lot in like the bigger the organization, most likely because they don't even know what happens after they sign a contract and start the deployment. Something happens and then they just never finished it, or they never onboarded new people that are coming on all the time, and they just never started onboarding more people to the tool. So there's the underutilization, and then there's also the effectiveness of the tool on its own merits. Like if you are using it 100%, what does it actually do? And you brought up a good point about, what did it actually detect? What did it actually prevent? And I think that's really difficult to tell sometimes, right? So how do you justify a tool where, what's the difference between it didn't detect it or it didn't happen? Right. So it's almost like the same problem that CISOs have. It's like you don't get a promotion because you didn't have a breach for 2 years in a row. Right. I mean, I think maybe there's arguments to be made for that being a thing, but I think a lot of companies don't do that. Right. You only get kind of dunked on if something happens, but when nothing happens, you don't get a pat on the back. Right. Like a lot of CISOs live in that world where, nothing happens and you don't get any credit. So how do you make that distinction?
Well, let's kind of go through the three things. How do you get good coverage? How do you get good utilization? And how do you get safeguarding capabilities? The coverage is you really need to go back to having an asset inventory. That's really, really important. For example, if I were to query Microsoft Intune and it says you have 10,000 endpoints, and then I were to query, let's call it CrowdStrike, which is your EDR, and it says you have 12,000 endpoints, something's wrong there, right? With those number counts. And what you may actually do is start actually querying, your DLP, your patch management tools, and all these other things that are there. And you might actually figure out you got 13,000 endpoints. And so now you have to kind of figure out where the coverage is missing on those agents so you can get better coverage. That's the first piece of doing that. Usually that's done by using some type of chasm tool. Let's call it an Exonius, a Jupyter One, something like that, where it aggregates all of those different, let's say, sources of data to say, what is the true count when we create a superset of all of these? Now, when it comes to the utilization, I personally think nobody's going to know more about a product than the vendor who basically created the product. So I would go to each of my vendors and I would say, what are the most important configurations you want turned on in the tool to give the best coverage? Almost like they're giving you the CIS benchmark of how to configure that tool. And then I would say, okay, did we follow that guidance? And, certainly if you're paying for a product, I think you can ask for those things and they should be able to give that back to you. And then you have to go and implement. Now, whether or not, let's call it one EDR is better than another EDR, this is where I don't think it is as valuable as most people make it out to be. And here's what I mean by that. A lot of times people really believe CrowdStrike versus Windows Defender versus SentinelOne is a massive decision. It is the most important decision because it'll give you the best coverage. If you are actually to go and look at the MITRE ATT&CK evaluations, where they take, the recent strains of ransomware every single year, and then they run it against 20 different EDR and AV tools, I think what you're going to find is so many of them are so close. Like the number of things that they can detect and stop is so close. And so what I would tell you is it's more important to have your features turned on correctly and being able to maximize the value of your tool than it is picking the right tool. And so, you probably should actually optimize for what gives you the best capabilities at the best price point versus going for a name brand that you may overpay on. And then you lose the budget to then buy a different tool that could really help your organization.
Well, given your very unique perspective as being, first on the offensive side and now on the defensive side, is there a category of tools, and you don't have to name vendors, that you think is totally useless or outright snake oil?
Well, I would say a lot of DLP tends to be very much snake oil. A lot of DLP works by first, I classify a Word doc, and let's call it secret or sensitive. And then I try to email that document through the network firewall to my personal Gmail. It's going to go in and say, secret or sensitive can't go to an external location. So what do? I just save that document as an unclassified or not sensitive document, and then I can email myself and it just gets right through. So things like that, I think, are a little bit of what we would call security theater. And when you start really digging into DLP bypass, it actually is really interesting. And I'll just give you maybe one war story. There was a company I wanted to break into that had a DLP. And so we started talking and figuring out how that DLP worked and what it didn't flag on. And one of the things it didn't flag on was having DLL files. Essentially, it didn't want to break the Windows DLL files because that would essentially stop your Windows operating system from working. So if you just named, let's call it, all the payment credit card data as a DLL file, you could just send it right out and it would be essentially auto-approved or whitelisted to go out. And so when you start really kind of pulling behind the scenes to say, how does this work on a technical layer? I think this is where you can start to see which things are security theater. I also routinely talk about, I think the whole third-party risk management process is very much security theater.
Yeah, no, that's actually pretty crazy. The fact that why would you ever need to send out DLL files from a client in the first place?
A lot of stuff is security theory. I agree with you. I think it's more buying peace of mind and compliance. I think a lot of those things, right? Like it's like, well, look, we're protecting ourselves from those things, and it's like better than nothing or whatever. But it kind of gets back to your original kind of thesis about stuff of like, yes, you can do this if you can afford it. Great, do it. Maybe it's better than nothing. Some companies can afford some snake oil, and maybe it does work on the bare minimum kind of like lazy attacks, right? I think you mentioned before, like you can spend all your money and still not be secure because some attackers are just, way more funded, capable, and persistent than others. So if someone really wants to get in, I think you can probably agree that they'll probably get in. So that's something to also consider. But maybe let's take it back a little bit more to, I guess, your broader thesis from your book, right? So cybersecurity's dirty secret. If most budgets go to waste, where should budgets go when the attacker is using, more modern tools?
I use the concept that cybersecurity is the business of revenue protection. And within cybersecurity, there tends to be two overarching goals. The first is I want to reduce, material risk from harming my company. And the second is I want to make sure I do any of the legal compliance requirements. If I'm operating as a financial bank, I have to do certain things as part of my licensure process, as part of, what I report to the SEC or other places. So I just have to follow those things. Now, here's the difference. On something that is a compliance piece, it makes no sense to spend a lot of money on these things. You actually want to do it in a minimum viable cost. Think of if they want, proof that I have a policy that's updated, I want to give them the bare minimum, piece of proof, because if I give them way more information, it just takes time, resources, budget that is wasted. And so I really want to focus on where the major attacks are. And so you might go in and look at something like the Verizon data breach report and say, well, certainly if you look at the top attacks, it's people being phished, it's people having their identity stolen. And if I have an internet facing website, maybe a bad actor is doing SQL injection attacks or some web application attack with, all the latest AI capabilities to break into my site. So now that I've kind of maybe defined where I believe my core attacks are likely to come from, then I want to go in and build a robust set of ways to solve that. So for example, if I'm really hyper focused on the web application attacks on my internet facing websites, maybe the best focus is how do I put in some really, really good CI/CD pipelines to block bad code from going to production? We start to think about, hey, I'm going to put a WAF to stop some web application attacks. I'm going to put an EDR tool on those servers to detect if any malware is being run. Maybe put some deception tools on that to see if somebody was able to bypass and they start trying to, get secrets or get keys. And then that allows me to know, hey, this machine's already been popped.
Do you think there's room in enterprise stacks or any kind of infrastructure for security through obscurity? That's been traditionally said, hey, you should never do that. But do you think there are scenarios where that is actually the preferred thing to do?
I absolutely think so. So take maybe a mindset shift that we've done for 20 years, which is, hey, let's leverage open source technology, right? It's free, it's good, it's out there. If I'm a company today, I don't know if I actually want to put my software as open source, because that just means, the latest version of Claude can go and inspect it to find vulnerabilities in that. And then now I am like on the 8 ball where I got, 30 minutes to respond with this incident because they found a new way to break through my software. And so you might say, well, I'm going to do commercial software and I'm not going to release my code publicly. I think that is a classic example of security through obscurity. You didn't share it, you didn't make it easily accessible, and you've actually defended your code in a way that I think makes a lot of sense because it's harder for them to essentially figure out how to break into your organization.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Yeah, especially like in the age right now, with all these like Strix or Shannon, where you just point it at a repo and it just spits out vulnerabilities. It is a scary time, and this kind of like loops into attackers moving at a very fast speed, and defenders are still kind of shackled in that sense. When a new model drops with new capabilities, defenders have to go through a series of meetings to get the approval to have a meeting in order to discuss potentially using this model in the next quarter, while the attackers are just pointing these tools at everything that they have access to, like hour one. And in a world like that, like what hope do defenders have?
I think the big thing is we need to use similar AI technologies to secure the organization. So let's take the example of where attackers are at today. They're probably going to use a tool like Showdown. They're going to find all the technologies that are used in your organization through an attack surface mapping. And then afterwards, they're going to then, maybe try to use Claude Code to, break a tool. So if they say, oh, it looks like I can see some outbound ports are being used by OpenClaw in your organization, and then I start trying to create custom malware against OpenClaw, I might find ways to go in. I mentioned earlier, you have a piece of software that has 200 vulnerabilities in it. Each vulnerability takes an hour to fix. That's 200 hours of vulns. or 5 weeks of work. Chances are you're not getting a developer to take 5 weeks of his time off just to do 100% patching. But what happens if Claude can actually fix those 200 vulns in 15 minutes? Now, I think you could say, hey, we expect to have 0 vulns. We expect you to kind of go through and fix these things. And so that, I think, is a game changer for us on the security side of how do we actually improve AppSec, ProdSec, which is really going to shrink our attack surface.
Yeah, I think there's kind of like two, I guess, headwinds to that idea. I think I agree with you that it's possible to have like 0 vulnerabilities, use the AI tools. I guess maybe 3. So there's the concept of, are you allowed to use these tools in your organization? The next one is something we're facing all the time is the tools are so fast and so easy to, patch, write code, find vulnerabilities, fix them, where the bottleneck then becomes validation, right? Where, yeah, you can patch 200 in 15 minutes, but can you confirm that any of those patches won't break production in 15 minutes when you deploy them? And the last one would be, you can't patch or use these tools on the defensive side when they're being used for like social engineering, right? So you can kind of have it sit in the middle as a middle person, like reading everything, looking at everything, and giving feedback to all your staff. If you have 10,000 employees and they're getting phished, how do you leverage AI to actually prevent them from being phished from like really sophisticated attacks with deepfake voices and video and emails and websites and all sorts of ways to actually make things look legit?
I'll split that into 2 pieces here. The first one is, how do you patch faster? And what I would say is it really comes back to the automated testing. And here's what I mean by that. If you were to deploy 200 patches and you didn't know if those would break prod or not, you're going to be very reluctant to deploy 200 patches. But if you could actually, instrument tools like the old Selenium grid, now Playwright, or other tools that can do all your automated testing, and you can prove that each one of these is not going to break the build, then you're actually going to be much more likely to deploy faster because you've proven, through some testing scripts that this doesn't break anything. Hey, we know we're going to have attacks like phishing that just never go away. And, maybe it's advanced phishing where they're using deepfakes and other things there. Now, if this happens, how is it we actually make sure the harm isn't present? And just take an example of identity, or maybe approving a money transfer. If anytime somebody logs into a website, they actually have to authenticate with, let's call it a hardware token or a key, and that's something the bad actor doesn't have access to, that limits them. And the other thing is, hey, we also maybe have firewall rules that limit it to only people on the VPN. That way, even if the bad actor steals the session keys, those can't be replayed because they're still blocked by the firewall rules. I think we need to change the process, right? It's not about, detecting a better email of phishing. It's about, how do we make sure when that happens, we follow an approved pattern? So if somebody comes in and they say, hey, I need to change my bank account, we go back to the phone number that's on file for that contract, and we do a phone call to them and say, I just received an email request to change your bank account number. Did you authorize this? And this, let's call it out of band communication via a phone call. They may go in and say, hey, that wasn't me at all. And you say, okay, well, it's either someone has broken into your systems and now able to email as you, or they're masquerading as you. Let's double check to see who really sent that email. And if you can figure out through DMARC and some of these other things that actually it came from that person, you may have just indicated that they actually had a compromise on their machine. Maybe their employees, their CEO's laptop has already been compromised, and they can send phishing emails legitimately as that person whenever they want. So having those robust processes, I think, is the better way to secure, instead of buying another technology that we know is only going to give you such a 99% or 95% accuracy of detecting these deepfake attacks.
Alex, I don't know if this is the right forum, but you had an attempted phishing attack recently. by the quote unquote RCMP.
Yeah, it was very convincing phone calls claiming to be RCMP and divulging like personal information.
Well, for those who don't know, RCMP is the Canadian version of the FBI.
Once they sent me an email, like at first they were just trying to, like, the only reason I was thinking it was legitimate at first is because they were trying to get me to go to an RCMP office, right? They're like, hey, we'll have you meet someone at the RCMP office and to talk to an officer. I'm like, well, okay, if I actually go there and there's an officer that meets me at one of their offices, I thought, okay, that's legitimate. But that was obviously all nonsense. And as it progressed, they sent me an email. I saw that the email was not from the RCMP. It just looked like it was vibe coded. And then that was that. But like, yeah, not everybody will be able to tell, I think.
Yeah, and one of the things that we're seeing right now is a lot of times people, when it's one person trying to deep fake them, they're like, that's not really the CEO. But when they have three deep fake accomplices on one Zoom call trying to do it, then it's like, maybe this is right. Maybe this is the CFO and the CEO and all telling me to do things. And they find the accuracy of those business email scams that are going on, or these, let's call it deepfake Zoom scams, is actually much, much higher because people don't think that three people could all be defaked at the same time to actually do this collusion attack.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the hardware key thing is like really missed by a lot of companies. Like if they use SMS, they use even Authenticator, but like not using hardware keys in these days is a huge mistake.
Right now, I'm maybe a little bit concerned on passkeys and software-based passkeys. So take the example of, I have a Chrome instance and I use a Chrome extension like 1Password, LastPass, or Bitwarden. I think if that is open at that moment when that laptop is totally, exploited, they're going to basically have the ability to export all of the keys, tokens, credentials on that machine. And so now if I can start to do some of those things, then of course I can just load my own Bitwarden on my own laptop and then import those passkeys, because it's not actually tied to one machine. They're actually tied to be able to use Bitwarden in your Chrome browser, Bitwarden on your phone, Bitwarden on your wife's laptop, and all these different places. And so I think these passkeys that people really think are secure in a software-based implementation is going to be, this kind of new way to break into companies that we're not thinking about enough today.
It's not just the passkeys either. It's TOTP codes is the same thing. All these password managers are now like, hey, do you want me to store the TOTP code along with your password? It's super convenient. And I personally sometimes use this myself because it's just so convenient, but it kind of defeats the whole point, once you think about it, of TOTP in the first place.
Back to that's convenience versus security, right? That it always comes back down to that.
Yeah, and you have to figure out what's right for your organization, right? And maybe the easiest thing is just a simple little YubiKey or Thal key that they have that you can just plug in and touch.
Hardware keys is a good spend for your budget, right? Yeah, you're going to spend like, what is it, like maybe $50 for a YubiKey. Maybe you need 2 of them as a backup. But yeah, that's that can quickly add up if you have like thousands of employees. But it's something that where I think it's money well spent.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, if everybody had MFA that required a hardware key, and then you had firewall rules that said, look, you're only people on the VPN can use all our internal services, that is a really, really good way. Because if some bad actor logs in, steals all your session keys, but still can't get through that VPN, and all of your passwords are, let's say, changing every 30 seconds because of the hardware key, that's a really good way to stop a lot of identity access issues. Does it stop everything? No. There's going to be some non-human identities and APIs and other things you're going to miss. But does it stop a lot of human identity issues? Absolutely. Right. And, just the speed of just tapping, a hardware key compared to, I got to open my phone. I got to go into the Authenticator app. I got to, get to the right company, and then I can type in the 6-digit code. I mean, that's 40 seconds of wasting my time times everybody in your company times 4 or 5 times a day. That's annoying versus, 1 second to just touch a hardware key that's always plugged in your laptop. That's pretty easy for folks.
So far, we've talked about, humans and how humans can be exploited, but we have a new class of operator that it already exists in some companies, but ultimately it will exist in every single company, which are agents that are essentially digital employees, right? Some of these already have access to mailboxes and they can literally receive email. And if you think about it, a phishing attack against a human it's kind of like prompt injection, if you think about it, right? But now that we're entering a world where that can actually happen against agentic employees, what sort of guardrails should exist, or how should this whole area be approached now that there's a completely different operator type who doesn't have hardware keys and cannot physically touch them?
So I think we need to just go back to maybe some old school traditional fundamentals. If I were to build an application just from scratch, no AI in it, just a normal app, and I wanted to, access some things, they would go in and they would say, what is the business justification? And what specific resources do you want to grant access to? And what are you granting access from an input and an output perspective? And then you typically have someone or maybe two individuals who do the approvals of that access and approvals of that application. I don't think that should change because of you're using agents. Now, I get we may want to make 1,000 agents, but I still think you want to build that similar process. The ability of an agent has star access to so many things is just going to be a bad place to start from because we just have no idea. And I'll just give you the example of a CRM system. Let's call it Salesforce and Office 365. Someone may want to go in and say, hey, if something happens with this customer, I want to trigger an email. Okay, that makes sense. There's probably some reason where we need to, send an email to a customer account. But if we like over provision and say, well, this agent has star access to Salesforce and has star access to Office 365, what keeps it from downloading, let's call it the entire customer directory, all their PII information, putting that into an Excel document and just making that publicly accessible in SharePoint? There's not many controls, and who would even be monitoring for those things? So I think we really have to go back to say each agent needs to have some type of review process where we're saying what's the business justification, what's the minimum access is needed, and then how do we kind of review that to make sure that's appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, going back to the basics makes complete sense, and it's a logical place to start. But ultimately, again, everything starts, not everything, but usually everything starts out of good intentions. It's okay, minimal access. This agent needs to do X, Y, and Z, so we'll only give it read-only access to the bare minimum, right? It's a safe place to start. But then, you realize, hey, okay, these capabilities could be significantly enhanced if they had access to this and this and this, and now you get this scope creep. And it moves a lot faster than it would with a human, because a human would need to absorb this information, take maybe weeks or even months to get comfortable with the access that they have before it's escalated. But in this case, escalation can happen in a matter of single-digit days, because you're like, oh wow, like if we gave it way more access, it could do so much more, and the cycle is now measured in maybe even hours ultimately, and that makes people, I would say, kind of way more careless. And like, how do you operate in a world like this?
I think the first thing is as soon as you have an agent, the first thing you need to say, what is our agent kill process? Like if the agent went bad and started doing all these bad things, how do we stop the agent from doing more bad? That's the first thing. The second thing that I would say is how do we actually log every one of the activities through an audit trail of what the agent performed? And then the third thing is how do I have a rollback process for my agent? And I'll just take the example of a simple agent that books, let's call it a plane flight. I say, hey, go book me a Southwest plane flight to New York on Friday because I got to be there on Friday night. And for some reason, it says, oh, I'm actually just going to book it for next Friday, not this Friday, because it misinterprets what I said. Well, what do I need to do? I need to undo that previous flight booking, and I still want you to book the original flight, that I asked. And so having that audit piece, having that undo, and having that ability to kill that script from causing more harm, I think is something we don't require historically on applications. Well, if something's bad, just, oh, go fix it in prod. And I think that is something we're going to really have to make sure is built before you actually get a approval to go live.
Yeah, I think there's some a little bit of work happening on that front. I think NVIDIA is doing some stuff with their Nemo Claw. They have the open shell that kind of tries to keep an audit trail of every command of an execution. And I think there's I think we're talking about like the response and like the containment of the agents. I think right now the biggest threat, and from my perspective, is the uncertainty with how easy it is to, let's say, phish or prompt inject an AI model, right? I think I forget the name of the company or the site, but there's a lab that's like kind of tracking this, and they're testing all of them to see how easy it is to prompt inject. And the current stats are 100% of all models can be prompt injected very easily. I don't know what kind of tests they're doing. It's in our own tests for our own agents, we don't get that level of success rate. But again, we haven't tried any advanced attacks, just like more naive ones. So I guess it's a matter of being, I think you're arguing for being disciplined with access control and being disciplined with audit trail of what it's doing. And I guess the only thing I can throw in there is like, if it has access to untrusted data, this is going to go back to the basics, just like code, right? If it has access to untrusted data because it's reading things off of X or it's reading things off of forums and searching the web, then you need to be a little bit even more vigilant and cautious with what it has access to.
Anytime we take customer inputs, that is a chance for harm, right? They can do SQL injection, they can do prompt injection, they can do all different types of attacks. So what is it we have to do? We have to sanitize those inputs as much as possible. We need to put some type of protection tool in front of it. Let's call it a WAF. Let's call it a AWS Bedrock guardrail. Whatever it is that's going to detect when someone is trying to abuse the model. Are they 100%? Absolutely not. There's always, some, let's call it search criteria that may not be in your WAF rules that are blocked or in your guardrails. But I think you need to say, when these things happen, how do we make sure our entire model isn't poisoned or harmed, right? Because one user, stealing one piece of data, that's bad. But it's a lot worse when they can poison the model and now you lose, 3 years worth of R&D on your model. So I think you have to really go in to say, how do we minimize the harm that one malicious prompt can do, and kind of work through some of those threat models like a stride analysis typically does to figure out what is it we're willing to accept and change.
There's one more area I'd like to touch upon, which we haven't really discussed. So we've talked about a bunch of stuff, including the Capital One breach, the budget waste, the machine speed offense, and all that kind of good stuff. I want to talk about this threat and safeguard matrix. That's a thing that you've been building over the years. Can you maybe briefly explain what this is to a CISO who's never seen it before, and then ideally, if that existed at the time of the Capital One breach, how would this matrix have possibly kind of helped shine a light on a situation and maybe even have prevented it in the first place?
Yeah, so the OWASP threat and safeguard matrix is something you can just download for free and read all up on it on the OWASP website. Essentially what it does is it says, let's put threats in a horizontal row of a matrix, think of an Excel spreadsheet. And then in the vertical columns, we're going to use the NIST functions of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And the idea being that I could put a material threat. Let's just say this is a web application attack. And then we would say, well, how would I identify where this could happen? Well, I probably need to have a good asset inventory of all of my web applications. That's the first thing. And then how would I stop that attack? Well, it depends on what kind of web application attack we're seeing. If it's an OWASP top 10, maybe I'm going to have a WAF in front of my site. If it's a DDoS, maybe I'm going to have a botnet or CAPTCHA tool in front of it. And you start to put in what those tools are. And, maybe it's as simple as we're just going to sanitize all of our user inputs. And then you say, well, what if the bad actor got in? how would we detect against it? Would I have any logs? Would I have any monitoring, alerting that would say, wow, something's really spiking? We mentioned before, maybe some deception tech tools, right? They don't actually stop the attack, but they can tell you when they are on that machine before, they do something else. And then how would you respond and recover? Do you respond? Do you maybe turn that machine off immediately? Do you just restart that server from a good configuration? What is you're going to do? And then, recover is kind of the how do I, solve the root cause problem of this? And you start to say, well, the root cause problem is maybe I have a misconfigured WAF. And so, how would I actually go and detect all of my proxy servers that are forward proxies versus reverse proxies and manually validate that these are correct? So, you can start to kind of like fill those little boxes in. And what it allows you to do is build this. Let's call it a defense in depth plan where I can take a variety of material threats and put those through those identify, protect, detect, respond, recover NIST phases and get some really good ways to observe how you're stopping material threats. And I just think this is so much more powerful than like 2 lines on the risk register that says, oh, we're going to do this. We've actually thought about it and built a defense in depth approach.
Yeah, it sounds like turning this framework into some kind of an agent that runs internally at your company that kind of codifies this and kind of asks, because ultimately the issue is like, oh, this is a great idea, and then someone has to go sit down and be like, okay, let me learn this thing. Okay, where are all these sources of data? Someone has to go and actively want to do this. If there was an agent that actively prompted you, it was like, hey, it's not like fill out this table, but what are the threats? Let me collect all this inventory about everything that is in the organization and actually kind of like run this process almost autonomously. Or is that kind of the vibe of the company that you've started?
Yeah, so if you go in the OWASP threat and safeguard matrix, you'll actually see that I've put a list of like 25 different threats that are there and even more. So it's like brand impersonation scams, business email compromise, business logic bugs, CEO impersonation, zero data attacks, unpatched laptops, people plugging in thumb drives, all these kind of things that we've historically seen. And then you would say, how would I, robustly build a defense in depth plan to stop those attacks?
Is there value in maybe kind of triaging those to look them like to have like a focus to see like, well, these are catastrophic and these we can kind of suffer through because they take a lot of work, let's say. For example, you mentioned like brand impersonations. For some companies that's catastrophic. For another company, maybe it's not. So like, how do you go about in the framework to know what should be on there and what is just noise?
So I would say every company is a little bit different, but usually you look at maybe last year in the company and say, what were the biggest threats that we saw? And then you maybe look at something like the Verizon data breach report and say, what are the new emerging attacks that we're likely to see in the next 6 months? And what's really increasing? And I think you're going to find it's different for every company. So, for example, at places like the Central Intelligence Agency, they're extremely worried about moles and insider threats. At Caterpillar, probably not something they care about too much. They probably care a lot more about the disruption of a production line. If they can't push out tractors, they can't push out mining equipment, that's $1 million losses, right? Not something CIA has. We don't have production lines like that. So knowing what the business is and how it makes money, really, really key in order to figure out what threats you're going to prioritize. And then I would also say the goal isn't to fill out the list with 500 different material threats to your company. You probably want to focus on a good like 5 or 7 of those because that's what you can pay attention to and really prioritize. Remember, at the end of the day, if you dilute all of your resources on solving 200 things, you may not actually have the right resources to solve the 3 most likely things that are going to cause your company a material outage. So don't dilute your resources by trying to solve too many problems.
Sounds like great advice.
If a CISO listening right now can only change like one thing next week because of this conversation, what would that single thing be, in your opinion?
I think the most important thing would be trying to really figure out what is a realistic security evaluation of your company. I'm not talking about a SOC 2 report. I'm not talking about, an ISO certification. I'm talking about, if you look at what are the most material threats, what are the ways that you have coverage, what are the ways you have utilization of your tools to stop those things, and actually get a deep, in-depth view. I think that's the most important thing to really understand your true risks. And you're going to go in and cover and figure out that, hey, we only have, EDR on 95% of the tools, and we got 8 of the 10 features turned off. What do we want to do here? And, how much can you handle? What's the cost? And balancing all of that, I think, is the real test of a CISO. There's always more things you want to do than what you have resources for. But knowing where to start, I think, is the most important issue. And the other thing I would also highlight, if anybody is like really concerned on how I do AI governance, how do I actually, automate my compliance and build more capabilities agentically, that's kind of the focus of my new company, Clear Capabilities. Always happy to talk to folks on that and see and give you some suggestions of where that industry is headed.
All right. Yeah. Thanks. I think that's pretty valuable advice. All right. I think we're just going to wrap up here. Thank you for your time, Ross. This has been very illuminating. And we hope you have a great day.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, Ross.
Yeah.